There we go. I think we can make a gentle start now if everyone's ready. So, hello, welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Simon Kay. I'm Policy Director for the independent think tank Restate, formerly known by another name, but we've decided to make a little bit of a change there for reasons we don't need to go into once again, do we? Do we? No, probably not. More than that, I'm also very proud to be the lead on one of our main programs at Restate called Reimagining the Local State. Now, welcome back today for another episode of Meetings with Mayors. I'm really excited to say that in just a moment, I will begin properly my conversation with my very patient guest today, who's going to sit through my usual opening blurb, Mayor Steve Rotheram, who is, of course, the mayor of one of the most vibrant, fascinating, brilliant city regions anywhere, Liverpool. For those joining us for the first time, a very quick note about what this is all about. Our work on reimagining the local state is about exploring the case for deeper, more radical, more lasting change across the whole system of local government and local public services, taking in devolution, public service reform, reorganisation, communities policy, but also crucially, the ways in which central government ought to adjust in order to make all of those things work better too. It's two sides to that coin, in our opinion. If you're interested in hearing about our work or you just want to learn some more, do look us up. If you Google Reimagining the Local State, that will probably get you where you need to go, or indeed pop me an email. My email address is right there on the website for anyone who wants to get in touch with any ideas. Meetings with Mayors is our big flagship event series in Reimagining the Local State. My ambition with this series is to have a conversation with every regional mayor in England. And of course, that's becoming more challenging over time because we keep electing more of them, which is obviously a fascinating moment to be having these conversations too. Why is that important? Well, I think regional mayors really are something new and something disruptive. They're an increasingly impactful new force in the way that British politics and British policy work, a disruptive force. They have direct personal mandates and legitimacy to do the things they want to do in the offices they hold, something that you simply can't say about most of our frontline politicians or leaders anywhere else in the country. They work within combined authorities, which are both the collaborative tool of and the big strategic body that overarches over clusters of local government councils in England. Our mayors wield significant powers, but they also operate within significant constraints, sometimes quite frustrating constraints. I'm not going to lead Steve into anything yet, but I think it's something we've heard in the event so far that it can be frustrating having your boundaries defined from central government so much. And quite often, what we find in our directly elected regional mayors is that these people stand apart somewhat from national politics as well, even from the political parties to which they belong. So I think all of that is really worthy of exploration. And who better to reflect on all of that from a variety of different perspectives than Steve Rotheram? One last bit of housekeeping from me. We do have an audience, obviously, the people I'm talking to right now joining us for today's live event. We will, as soon as possible, be sharing it as a video and a podcast as well. If you are joining us live, then you can participate in this discussion. So please do use the Q&A function in Zoom here. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see an option called Q&A. Share any questions that occur to you there at any point, and we will come to those and integrate those into our second half of our conversation today. So that's more than enough from me. So finally, and with very little further ado, sorry, Steve, welcome Steve Rotheram to Meetings with Mayors today.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to be interested in the sort of issues that we touch upon.
Thank you so much for joining us, Steve. Now, I tend to sort of start and finish these conversations in more or less the same way each time. So I like to start by asking the kind of the obvious question, really. If you were talking to someone who doesn't know you, what made you want to be a mayor, and what made you want to be the mayor of Liverpool City Region specifically?
Wow, what a question to start with. So my background is that my dad was a councillor way back in the 70s for a place in Kirby called Tower Hill. And actually that turned not just myself, but the whole family off politics for a long time, because I think they're the unsung heroes, our councillors of all different political persuasions, but they do a lot of the heavy lifting, and we don't see an awful lot of them in the media, unless they've done something wrong, of course. But they're an essential function of our democratic system. We see a lot from MPs, of course, and now Metro mayors. We see a lot of stuff that they're doing as well. What happened was I got a letter saying that my ward was likely to stop functioning because people hadn't been going there for some considerable time. And I was a member of the party, the Labour Party, and I should get involved. And I knew that I shouldn't because, as you know, the party has a way of attracting people in, and then they'll ask them to do a small little bit of perhaps leafleting in their road, and then it becomes a wider area, and then you go into meetings, and the next thing is you're in a position within your local community, whereby I was a councillor, and then I was the Lord Mayor of Liverpool. That's the one with the chain on, the one that cuts all the ribbons. And it was during our European Capital of Culture year in the international spotlight. I did 2,000 events in 12 months, which is, a staggering amount if you think about 365 days and doing that. And then, of course, the former MP for Liverpool Walton, Peter Kilfoyle, decided that he was stepping down and said to me I should put my name forward and he'd support me. And then I became the MP. And then in 2017, me and another mayor you won't have heard of called Andy Burnham decided in a pub in Westminster that actually these new positions, Metro mayors, was something that if we were the first ones in, we could shape and it could become something of a major benefit. So that's the journey, if you like, to becoming a Metro mayor. And in the last sort of 8 and a bit years, it's the best job in the world.
It's wonderful to hear someone who loves their job. Every so often I talk to people who don't feel that way, whether they're in Westminster or Whitehall or local governments. That's great to hear. I was looking again at the book you wrote with Andy Burnham, who you just mentioned, in preparation for today. And since you brought up your time as an MP, there's a quote that I dug out from that, probably the one that's been repeated back to you quite a lot. The book's called Look North, by the way, for anyone watching or listening now or later. Really, really well worth a read. As a backbench MP, I felt powerless, you wrote. It is only when you step away from Westminster that you realise how dysfunctional it really is and how many people have become institutionalised down there. Has that feeling deepened over time as the distance between you and Westminster has grown? Or maybe don't let me put words in your mouth. Has the distance got bigger?
It probably has, and we see, don't we, with what's happening down there at this moment in time with PIP and the stuff on benefit reform, that sometimes there's an expectancy that just because you are in that political party, that whatever comes from the centre has to be something that everybody collectively agrees with. And there's always going to be different ideas, different views, and there's going to be often dissent in political parties. And actually, that's not a bad thing for democracy if that happens, not just for the sake of it, but if it's on something where you think there's a moral, ethical, or case of consciousness. And that's, I think, where we are today with what's happening, where I think it's 130 odd MPs now are likely to vote against the government with a reasoned amendment. I've actually been there once myself, and it was a terrible moment because at that stage we were in opposition and trying to hold the party together, and we abstained actually on a welfare reform bill that still rankles with me now. It's the only time as a politician I've ever voted for something that I wasn't supportive of, or voted against something that I wasn't supportive of, or abstained in this case on an issue that I wasn't supportive of our position as a party. So I do get the MPs who at this moment are wrestling with their conscience, because they have got a very difficult issue to resolve. But that's the job, isn't it? You go down there, you paid a king's ransom, from the average working person. Obviously, people unfortunately believe that you go to the members' tea room and they feed you gold and everything's wonderful. It's not. It's a very different world, and sometimes is illustrated in our media. But it's a really important job as well, and those people, I'm sure, will be wrestling with their conscience over the next few days.
And I suppose one of the things that's sort of implied by that, by what's in your book, and I think by what you just said as well, is that you can, please don't let me put words in your mouth, but you can operate with more clarity of conscience and feel better connected to your ability to follow your conscience in the position you're in now, a position like a directly elected mayoralty, than you might when you're that much closer to the big national party machine in Westminster. Is that a big difference? Something that you think about a lot, that difference?
It's a huge difference. Don't forget, we're not whipped in the same way as MPs are. So that's why it gives us the semi-freedom to do some of the things that we want to do. But we've also been able to demonstrate that, given the power that we were originally from a Tory government, with, there was 4 Tories mayors and 3 Labour mayors at the time. So, that's been turned on its head. And now we've got Reform mayors as well who've joined us as a group. But you get an awful lot more freedom, because just the same as the Prime Minister says that he would put country first and politics second, well, we can put place first, and we do very much put place first and party politics second. And that's why we've been so successful in demonstrating that devolution is not a sort of flash in the pan. Devolution, the genie is out of the bottle. It's going to be here for a long time. It was sort of more decentralisation with the Tories, and Labour are now working with some areas with the intent of giving them proper devolved powers and resources, proper devolution, a single integrated settlement, for instance, in Greater Manchester and West Midlands, coming to the Liverpool City region next year.
Which is an extraordinary step forward, because I mean, there's quite a lot in the book that we were just talking about, where your friend Andy Burnham reflects on how important of a step it is for Manchester to be getting that integrated settlement. And you must be in the midst of the same sort of negotiation process now that he experienced. How are you finding that? Because I suppose, coming from your experience both of local politics and national politics, you've got a slightly different lens than some mayors would have on the way the sausage is made in Whitehall, and now you're having to be right there in the sausage factory again to try and get this deal over the line. Or is that an unfair characterization?
No, I don't think it's unfair. I think you have to understand the machinery of government, don't you? I mean, you're right. If it's a sausage maker, then you have to understand that what comes in and what comes out of that process is really important. So we're trying to feed the right information into central government so that we can get a decent outcome for the Liverpool City region. But look, you have to understand where we've come from. Over the last few decades, Liverpool was a byword for chaos in regard to local government, and we've been able to demonstrate a maturity now in our political institutions that a government previously of a Tory persuasion, looked upon us as being one of the sort of the premier combined authorities in the country. And certainly with the new government, they've given us much more prominence. And if you have a look at some of the announcements that have been made and some of the things where we've been able to exert influence, then Liverpool City Region's position is becoming more and more important to UK PLC. And genuinely, when you think about the preeminence of this place, because I'm talking to you now and I can see like there's ferries on the Mersey literally outside my window, the Albert Docks there, and all the wonderful regeneration that's taken place around me. And I just think about us regaining some of that um, that preeminence that was once taken for granted here, and we're now working with government who shares that ambition.
Yeah, look, this is my opportunity to say something, which is that my favorite part of my job really at the moment is being able to visit Liverpool very frequently. Seems like almost every major conference that's getting held seems to be held right now in Liverpool. But it's always a treat to visit the city. It's also a lot of responsibility being the most, I suppose this is fair to say, the most visible politician, the most visible leader of a city as storied, as culturally important as Liverpool. Do you sit with that responsibility a lot? Is that something that shapes your actions a lot?
It's a huge responsibility because you can probably tell by the accent. I'm from these areas, you know, that there's 6 local authorities that form the combined authority for the Liverpool City region. I I love the place. I love the people, and so when something happens, it is expected that you would be there to articulate other concerns. So for Southport, for instance, we were pushed very much into the spotlight because of the murder of those 3 little girls. But whilst, of course, it was about explaining the circumstances and the response from not just the police but from the community in that regard, it was also about trying to reassure people that these things, you know, are very few and far between, thankfully, and that our area isn't how some people would portray it. And that's been really important as somebody who feels passionately about this place, to sort of have to disassociate yourself with the emotional side of things and then try to calmly explain what the situation is. And something similar happened in it with the parade. Liverpool had a huge parade, 1.25 million people on the streets for Liverpool Football Club's Premier League parade. And then there was the incident in what's called Water Street, where somebody drove through the crowd. Now, there's lots and lots of things that you can get trained for. There are lots and lots of things that experience will help you and aid you with. But when things like that happen, there's no playbook. You know, they are things where you as an individual and your values and principles and beliefs are really important, because you're speaking on behalf of people who primarily feel the same sort of things and hate, you know, to an equal measure as you, but you're the spokesperson for those concerns. So hopefully I've done some justice to that. But you're right, it's a huge responsibility to have to do those things.
And so there's something there about embodying these people at the same time as you represent them, which I think is distinctive to a mayor. Do you think, and I mean, you must have conversations with just Liverpudlians, people who live there all the time. Do you think people get it? The reason I asked, you know, I was up in Liverpool for a conference not so very long ago, and I got chatting to one of the guys who was working in the conference centre, and he says, "What's all this about?" He was asking what we feel. I'm here for Labour Party conference. And he says, "Oh right, yeah, okay." And I said, "You know, is that it? You're going to go home after this?" I said, "No, I'm going to be here overnight because I've got a meeting tomorrow with the combined authority." And he says, "Who?" And I said, "With the combined authority, Liverpool City Region Combined Authority." I said, "Oh, okay." And then I had to mention your name. I wasn't meeting with you. I was meeting with people who work for you, Steve. But it took quite a while for him to click what I was talking about. I think this is true across the system. There's a weird paradox here. We've got directly elected mayors with personal mandates. They are the most visible and the most directly empowered people we have in the country. But they're also, I think, sort of slightly flying under the radar for some of the populations being governed by them. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, and it's not just that some people don't know. There's plenty of people who don't know, and I don't blame them, by the way. We're not getting the message over. But there's also a disassociation because of the geography. Just the same as Westminster has an issue for areas. If you drew concentric circles, it'd probably get greater and greater and greater the further you got away from London. It's the same thing happens in regional governments where the epicenter is normally the big city because they're called city regions. So Liverpool in our case, or Manchester, or Birmingham, or Leeds, or whatever it might be. I think the people in Halton perhaps don't feel as associated. I think people in before what happened in Southport, but in that end of the city region, feel less attached to Liverpool. Some places, of course, don't even like the fact that it's called the Liverpool City region because they don't feel that they are part of Liverpool City. And actually, it should be Liverpool and then hyphen City region. It's not Liverpool City hyphen region. You know what I mean? It's not the
Yeah, that's
city.
it.
And that's the thing. They all have their own identities, and they all have. Most of them have their own accents. I've just come back from St Helens, where this morning we've just ignited the furnaces at somewhere called Glass Futures. Glass Futures is a global first. So it's happening in St Helens, but nowhere in the world has done what they are doing at the moment. And it's very experimental. And we as a combined authority put a lot of money into that. But it's Glass Futures that's at the front of that. And it's about the decarbonisation of energy intensive industries. And that'll get headlines. But there'll be very little at the combined authority funded it. And the reason that it's here is that we had conversations to attract it here. So people don't see the mechanics of it, but they do see the end results. And when you point it out and say, well, we did that, when for instance, we franchise our buses, when we're able to say, look, that's because of us. When people see the brand new trains that we've bought, £500 million worth of the most sophisticated and accessible trains in the whole country, that's when people start to go, oh, right. But they don't necessarily think that it's because of a combined authority.
That's so interesting because there's obviously going to be priorities in different combined authorities. And I think it's still an open question the extent to which combined authorities, mayors as well, will either get the benefit or the blame for the things that go on within what's in the control or beyond it. So in Liverpool, and certainly this is true from the outside looking in, I think one of the really interesting things about how Liverpool City region operates is that I think it's emerging, and I'm sure this is deliberate, as a sort of a hub for public services innovation. So there's some really innovative practice happening there that we talk about when we're talking about policy change here. You've got the Office for Public Service Innovation, OPSI. You've got projects like Cradle to Career, which I know you're very passionate about. I think the stuff around Housing First, was actually a different wraparound model for the way that housing can create the conditions for other improvements in other areas. There's lots of interesting public service innovation there. So how does a city region play into that? It's not just a matter of narrative, but the reality of how a city region can help innovation to happen, to shift the way public services function. How do you see your role and the combined authorities' role in helping affect that change and owning the responsibility?
We've got a government who believes that prevention is better than cure. And so some of those early interventions are things that we can evidence now because we have both the infrastructure and the ecosystem alongside that. So if I briefly highlight the infrastructure, and I genuinely could go on for hours about this because it's the most amazing thing about how I came about the idea. But there's never been a benevolent government from Westminster who's done anything like this for any area in the country. But we can do those things and shape those things ourselves. And it is that I found out that we had these two assets, and one of them is something called the Hartree supercomputer, the most sophisticated industrial computer in the whole country, not on Oxford or Cambridge, but on our doorstep in the Liverpool City region. Who knew about it? Nobody. And then I found that the fiber optic cables, the transatlantic cables, come ashore in Southport. And talking to clever people, I said, what happens if we join these two assets together? And we've done that. We've created something called LCR Connect. It's 214 kilometers of dark fiber in the ground. It gives us now the best digital speeds in the country and the capacity for big data analytics. But also, it's attracted a lot of attention from investors. So FDI, foreign direct investment, coming here. Sitting on top of that, we've got the Civic Data Cooperative. So we've found ways around GDPR and data protection and stuff like that, legitimate ways in which we can share information in a completely different format than anywhere else in the country. So you've got these assets that are now there, and they're the sort of things that only somebody from the area could do. There's just nobody from down south who could do those sort of things. So that's why I think the ability to shape your own destiny is so important in these sort of debates, and we're just getting on and doing it and attracting, of course, huge inward investment such as Kyndryl to our city region. The world's largest IT infrastructure company coming to Liverpool and not going to Shoreditch, or not going to London or perhaps other areas, choosing to come to Liverpool because we're reinventing ourselves as an innovation hub.
I suppose the natural next question then is that if the model's working to enable that kind of opportunity, do you think if you had more tools at your disposal, more even than those that are promised to come with an integrated settlement, you'd be able to do more with them? Do you ever feel hamstrung still by the buffers on your bowling lane that are established not by you, but of course by central government?
But what I would say is that when I first came in, our devolution agreement was really Mickey Mouse. It was honestly, it was back of a fag paper stuff. So we've learned some lessons, and also that there's an old adage that Scousers learn to read between the lines before they read words. And so in the devolution agreement, it tells me lots of things that I have to do, but it doesn't tell me anywhere things that I can't do. So I was just getting on and doing them, despite the fact that they weren't part of devolution. I'm waiting for a Tory government to say, you shouldn't be entering into that sort of sector. They never did. And we've gone on and done all sorts of things. In fact, homelessness wasn't one of the issues. And the first day that I came in here, I read a report from Crisis, which was about a housing first approach to homelessness. And we've now had the pilot going in the Liverpool City region, and Manchester and West Mids have also got pilots, because that was one of the first things that I did, is to say to the government, look, we could do things differently with this organisation called the Combined Authority. And it's demonstrably been successful. But you're right, some of the other initiatives that we're doing are all about a different approach, but a collaborative approach. And in our area, and lots of other areas, but in our area, they are desperate to partner now with the Combined Authority. Beforehand, we were knocking on doors and saying, please, will you work with us? Believe me, I need a revolving door on my office here, because the amount of people who want to be in and out, and that shows you that devolution must be working and it must be successful.
And I suppose for some policy wonk type people like me, more radical, deeper devolution should follow where devolution is having successes, right? And what that really means for a whole category of person is fiscal devolution, more control over the revenue itself. Where do you stand on that question? Could fiscal devolution help you to transform Liverpool?
Well, it could, and it sort of already is, because we've got a precept. We introduced a precept, and it's only, I say only, it's £15 a year on someone's council tax bill, and it's a separate line, so it shows you that it's the mayoral precept. So I do get a lot of stick for it. But that has meant, for instance, that we can franchise our buses and bring our buses back into public control. It's meant that because it's, if you like, clean money, not national government money, that we can do our own thing with the flexibilities that if we see something such as LCR Connect, we can invest in those things, knowing that there's a revenue stream coming in. And the next one that we've asked the government to provide us with the ability for a pilot scheme is a tourist tax. And look, I know that there are some people for and some people against, but this is the argument that I've always put forward, and I was the first one to talk about this. When you book a holiday in Barcelona or New York or wherever, you don't go, oh, well, listen, that £2 a night or $2 a night or €2 a night is the difference between me going to that place and not going to that place. It doesn't become a consideration. And, whilst we all sort of squirm a bit when they give you the bill for a local tax or whatever it might be called, we all pay it and then it's forgotten about, within days. And the same will happen here. The only problem with being the first mover on anything is that does attract all of these centres. So just as on my trains where we introduced battery technology, and you can imagine that there were issues, with teething problems with the new technology. Loads of people give you a stick. You don't know what you're doing. And it's because you want to be innovative that you're doing these things. So you're bound to hit those issues. And it's the same with the tourist tax. I'm absolutely certain that if it became widespread, it would become the norm, and no one would even think twice about a local tax. But what it can do for an area is immense. If we introduce one, maybe £1 or two in the Liverpool city region, the whole city region, not the city centre, we'd be talking about £11 million ish a year. I could borrow forward £100 million with the guarantee that I'm paying it back in 10 years like that. And that money then could go towards doing things now that would attract even more people. So we've got a really growing cruise liner infrastructure in the city region. But actually, we've gone from 40 cruise liners when I started to 105, I think it is, this year. And they want to go to 200. So that means that we have to build more facilities to get people, because they can walk from our cruise liner facility into the city centre. So we can have 2 cruise liners together. You're going to have to build those things. Are we going to wait for the national government to do this for us? The idea of fiscal devolution is that we would do that, we would build it, and we would get a return on the investment very, very quickly. So there's a whole host of different things I'd like to do. And of course, and I'm being very careful with the words that I choose, but because it's nothing to do with an Alba Voyage type thing, but we would like to do something around a local band and have an immersive experience for the American market, especially coming in here, and they'll be able to see, a local band playing in their different sorts of genres.
I mean, now you've said it, it seems like the most obvious thing in the world. What a great idea. I'm really conscious that we've got some good questions, quite spiky questions, some of them coming in from folks in the chat here. I don't know if you can see them too, Steve, but I'll start bringing some of those to you in just a second. Very quick one from me just before that, because I think it would be wrong to skip over this. Obviously, devolution is rolling out one way or another across the whole country now, partly templated on stuff that's happening in, yes, Manchester and the West Midlands, but also in places like Liverpool City region. And some of your neighbouring areas now, you were seeing devolution getting put together there in Warrington, Lancashire. How do you think that's going to change the way you do your job? Do you think it'll change the way you do your job at all?
No, I think it enhances what's already happening. Look, I'm not one of those who believes that we've done okay, and let's pull up the drawbridge and protect the advantages that we've had from devolution. Everyone should be able to shape what it is, their own identity, their own destiny as well. I just think that the way that we've gone about it, if it hadn't been for myself and Andy Burnham, who along with Ben Houghton, we're the only ones who have lasted the full course, from day one of devolution. But if it hadn't been for Andy really and his experience within national government running a department, because I'd never run a government department, I think it would have been a very, very different devolution offer today. And it's because of him being able to persuade a Tory government alongside myself and the other mayors at the time, who were all Tories, but persuading them that we could do things, then I don't know where we would be today, but everybody should have the same opportunities that we've been fortunate enough to have had for 8 years.
Right. Now I think we should look at the spikier questions first and just sort of take them on, as long as you're happy to,
Yeah.
Steve. So the first question we got asked today at just 12 minutes past the hour is provocative indeed. Why shouldn't, asks an anonymous attendee, Liverpool and Manchester merge? Is the only barrier a lack of the political courage needed to overcome the identity differences? And so I don't know what you think on that, but the identity differences are really, really, really significant, aren't they?
Liverchester. No, I can't see it ever happening. And I think that was partly the issue that we had with the NWDA. And do you remember Gordon Brown trying to sort of get regional assemblies? And that is that people don't want to lose their individual identities. And I don't think we should either. It's been difficult holding the circle of 6 local authorities here. And I know Andy's been doing the same with 10 in Greater Manchester. Having those together, and you couldn't do that. You couldn't possibly do Liverpool and Manchester without the Cheshires, because that's the bit, in the middle, sort of Warrington and that. So it'd have to be a much bigger area, and basically that's the northwest, isn't it? Then you pull it together. Lancashire, they're looking for a Devo deal at the moment. Cheshire in the midst of trying to sort out theirs, and then if you want to go a little bit further, you've got Cumbria. But that's a huge area, and actually, how would that provide the opportunity for people to shape their own identities? I'm not sure it would. It just become a huge administrative area, and you can imagine the rivalries. If £100 million was spent on something in Greater Manchester, is Liverpool going to go, well, that's fair enough because it's in the northwest, isn't it? I don't think so.
Yeah, I think it's a non-starter for lots of reasons, isn't it? But it's I think the identity ones are enormous. So here's one that sort of comes at that from a different angle. Again, an anonymously asked question, I should say. What's needed for Liverpool City region to, quote, surpass the devolution leaders in WMCA and GMCA? I suppose the version of the question that might be really interesting to ask here, Steve, is whether in the fullness of time you think there wouldn't be a difference in terms of the way we think of Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham, in terms of their autonomy, in terms of the powers, in terms of their economic prosperity. Is that essentially the vision? And what's it going to take to get there?
Well, the powers and resources, it'll be the same next year. So, in March next year, we'll be finalising the deal, and ours will be the same as those other areas. I think that convergence is going to take some time because our starting points were all very different. I worked with Sir Howard Bernstein to do a report called the Liverpool Strategic Futures Advisory Panel report, which actually was the precursor to OPSI. So one of the suggestions within that was that we needed to have public service reform. But Howard was in place 20 years ago when Manchester had a long-term vision. And Liverpool didn't have the same sort of long-term vision. We know the history of local politics in Liverpool. And so whilst Manchester was sort of, playing along with whatever the colour of the national government was, we were quite prepared over a couple of generations ago to fight and take that government on. And in some ways, that's very laudable because we need to be standing up against tyrannical governments like Thatcher's. But it did mean that the government sort of gave us a bit of a punishment beating, and the investment didn't come forward in the way it did to Manchester. Manchester, of course, also had the IRA bombing and decided to use that period then as, instead of repairing, they regenerated. And Liverpool City region hasn't had that sort of singular vision. It has now, and it has for the sort of last 8 years, and everybody is pulling in the same direction. And there are huge lessons to learn from Greater Manchester. But would you, if you ask me where would I rather be at this moment in time, I'd rather be where we are, because I know that the platform and the foundations are there for the huge growth that we'll see across our city region. Halton's one of the fastest growing places in the country. And you see the fantastic stuff that they're doing in other areas, such as, Knowsley. If you go to Knowsley, I'm a Knowsley lad. I was born in Kirby. It's hardly recognisable from when I was growing up. So there are huge steps forward, but as I say, that's because our baseline was slightly behind other areas. But if you look at the journey, I think our journey is as impressive, probably more impressive than anywhere else.
I think that one of the things raised by that, that I think this next question kind of gets to the heart of, is that one of the features of what's going on in Birmingham and Manchester is that the mayors there are really expected to be across everything. Now, that sounds obvious and silly almost to say out loud, but in theory, these are leaders who are supposed to be quite narrowly focused on economic growth, transport, a specific set of responsibilities. Something that's been a bit of a theme in these meetings with mayors events is how that sort of breaks down pretty quickly. When you're that visible, you kind of need to have something to say about every aspect of local and indeed national services and what's going on in people's lives and affecting people's lives. So the question is, I think it's an interesting question. What powers do you not want to have control over? Do you not want to have devolved to you for direct control? Is this only a question of capacity, or should combined authorities have more of a specific focus on, for example, economic growth? What do you think?
Look, the obvious ones, aren't they, like national security and armed forces? So I'd say that for me, my starting point is devolution by default. If it can be done locally, it should be done locally. And there's nothing that I'd balk at. In fact, we're having conversations now because we're not an area that has coterminosity with our constabulary. So our Merseyside police are 5 of the 6 areas, and then the other one is Cheshire Constabulary. So we are trying to sort that geometry out and see whether we can get to the situation where we would also be the Metro Mayor and the Police and Crime Commissioner combined, same as some other areas. We can imagine across the geography of the UK, that's going to be quite difficult to do. But I do believe that if you can pull more of those powers away from the centre and have decision making at a more local level, that's the best way in which you can get innovation. You can get public service reform. You can get new approaches. You can get collaboration, genuine collaboration, and partnerships. That's the way to do it, and that's why devolution, I think, its day has come.
I think that's a good answer to that question, for sure. What do you think is the future? Asks one of our live attendees. What do you think is the future for mayoral cooperation now that we have an increasing party political diversity among mayors? I think that's a really important question, isn't it? When you attend those councils of regions and nations meetings, there's a bigger viewpoint diversity sitting around that table now. You might argue that's sort of a healthy thing for the system.
Well, it's probably a good thing for democracy, although I'd say a couple of the recent recruits from their party perspective don't really believe in the same sort of democracy that I do. So it's broadened the scope, and the spectrum of views. But bizarrely, at the last meeting, which was the first time that Reform had been at a Council of Nations and Regions, they were supporting the Prime Minister in some of the things that he was saying that he wanted to do in regard to devolve powers and trying to attract investment into the UK through ourselves. And so there wasn't any dissent at all from the new recruits. But we'd have to see how it plays out after a while, because we've tried desperately, even under the Tories, we tried never to be party political when we were in those sort of fora. It depends on how these new characters either supplement or upset the balance of the chemistry within that group.
Well, I mean, mayors themselves, I suppose, are a disruptive part of the system. They're supposed to make us question our assumptions. So maybe that's just an additional layer of disruption to take things further. So there's an interesting question here about accountability that I'll sort of paraphrase. The question asks, "Are you sufficiently held to account?" And who's ever said no to that? But there is an interesting point here. It's a big part of what the government's devolution plans, as put out in their white paper, isn't it? That there's going to be greater powers on offer. There's going to be more consistent powers on offer, as we've just been talking about. But accountability needs to be deepened too. Do you think they're going in the right direction with the accountability piece?
I think the more scrutiny and pre-scrutiny that metro mayors are involved in, the more confidence that will give to the wider public, and certainly to government, that we're spending limited public funding in the right way and getting a bigger bang for our buck. I've said from day one that my books will be open to anyone, and in so much as I think I've only missed in 8 years. I think I've only missed one overview and scrutiny committee meeting because I was abroad, and I think that's so essential that we don't get to a situation where it becomes, that, as I say, that Mickey Mouse party political bun fight, because it's far too important for those parochial arguments to spill over and to stop us or to knock us off course from where we need to get to. I would say to the questioner, though, we're probably the most accountable politicians in this country, and probably much further than these shows. So for the money that we get from departments, we have to justify that money through departmental spend. Through the overall funding we get, we have an assurance framework with national government, and that's open to obviously NAO and all sorts of scrutiny. We have a local scrutiny panel made up of primarily opposition councillors, but it's chaired by an opposition councillor as well. So you have that independence. For the gain share money, we have to go through a gateway process so that they can see that we're getting a bigger bang for our buck on that. And then politically, we have to stand in front of the electorate with our manifestos for a 4-year term. I think that probably makes us some of the most accountable people in the country. And we have to do, well, we don't have to, but we do radio phone-ins, myself and Andy. I think a couple of others do radio, where anyone can ask any question, and they do. We have question times where we go out, and again, in the community, people can ask. So there's all sorts of ways in which people contact us. We have hundreds of letters and emails and FOIs and all sorts of stuff every single week. The press are all over us because every time we say something, it's for or against, whatever we've said. So, yeah, there's a lot of sort of prescriptive scrutiny, but there's also that ad hoc stuff. Anything that you say is always on the record.
think that's a really that's a really good answer. And actually, you've made me think again about that accountability question, which is it should be flipped. You know, is there really anyone else in the system who gets more direct scrutiny? I suppose the one where the public might push back would be the democratic accountability part. So in a way, you are the most democratically accountable people in the country. You're directly elected to do your jobs, and you go to office because of it. That's not true for really any other part of our system. But the turnouts, they're stubbornly low, and I think mysteriously low. Actually, if you look at what's on offer, what decisions can be made, what the resources are at stake, there's enough efficacy to our mayors, our directly elected mayors, that you think that election process would be more popular, would involve more people turning out to vote. Is this something you think about?
Yeah, a lot, and you're spot on. Again, we're seeing that the electorate are probably a bit peeved per se with political parties and with elections. No, there's never been anybody that I've knocked on the door to who said, "Oh, brilliant! Are we going to have an election? Are we soon?" It's not the sort of thing that most people think about. Politicians are obsessed by it, and so do the media. But they are big barometers of where the general thinking is. So even though I think ours might have been about 25% last time, so a quarter of people voted in a really important election. But do you know what? If you had been doing something that had really peed people off, that means that they would have definitely come out and voted against. So in a strange way, it's almost an acceptance that you must be doing things well because people aren't against something. And people are much more likely to vote against something than for something. And that's the territory that reform really has capitalized on. It's always that against whatever, against immigration. There's never the solution to it, but it's that easy thing to be anti whatever the issue might be.
I think it's an interesting one. It's one that comes through in the evidence that I'm aware of in the research that I sometimes find myself looking at, which is that voter apathy can really just be a function of not being motivated to try to dismiss the people who are currently in office. Whereas high level turnout quite often is associated with a change election where a shift is wanted. But I wonder if that's the whole picture. And there seems to be a much bigger story to tell right now, as you sort of indicated there, about how people are disengaging a little bit from politics.
Yeah, look, there's definitely an ambivalence. It just does exist, and the reason that you would possibly evidence something is how many planning committees have ever had large groups of people saying, "Look, we want that such and such a thing built by our house," and whereas conversely, any planning application that comes in, people always object to whatever it might be, and that's because they can gather a lot of support opposing something. And you're right, even my own party, they talked about change. After 14 years at Tories, they talked about change. It was about change, and then you do have to change something when you get in, and you can't perpetuate the same sort of policies as your predecessor. And so it has to be radical. And I think metro mayors from the areas that I've been and visited, and I've been to quite a lot of the other metro mayoral areas, they've been quite radical. If you have a look at public transport, for instance, nothing has happened on public transport for donkey's years. John Major, I think it was in 84 or 5, who he deregulated buses. Well, the first re-regulated bus, if you like, buses taken back into public control was Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester. The second will be me in the Liverpool City region. The third will be Tracy Brabin. The fourth, so it's metro mayors who are doing these things. And I think you can change the way and the look of a transport system, but also of an area, because it gives it an identity, and I think that's why it's really important.
I think that leads us really beautifully to our traditional final question for these meetings with mayors, which conveniently has also been asked more or less by one of the people joining us live today. What would your advice be to someone who is setting up and intends to become, or is on the cusp of being elected to become, a new mayor of a combined authority or strategic authority? What do you think the big thing that you wish you'd known at the start would be?
Well, we've got a couple of, well, we've got 3 or 4, haven't we, new mayors. And in the west of England, we actually, myself and Andy, went to the west of England to support our candidate there. And she's going to need some support. And we've said, whatever it might be that you need support and help and assistance with, we'll provide it for you. You know, we genuinely will be an open book. So if you want to talk about transport or housing or skills or spatial development or innovation or etc., you know, climate emergency, we'll provide that support to you. And I think that's a way in which they can quickly hit the ground running, because that's the biggest lesson for me. When I first came in, what we were talking about is ensuring that we had the right strategic documentation so that we could draw down some of these funds. And we spent a lot of time early on doing that. Again, on the doorstep, no one's ever said to me, do you know what I voted for you for, Steve? It's because your strategic documentation was absolutely brilliant early on. What they want is to see something. They want to be able to point at something you've done. They want to be able to have hope that's going to be a better future for their kids and grandkids. And especially when you knock on doors of like grandparents, it's normally the grandkids that, you know, the kids are growing up, so it's the grandkids. And when you can say, you know, have a look what we're doing with breaking down some of the barriers for your kids, not just to go to university, but to have perhaps a degree apprenticeship, so they're not accruing the tuition fees through academia. Have a look what we're doing about housing in this area, so they can stay close by, you know, and have different types of housing and different housing approaches. Have a look at what we're doing about attracting the really good jobs, so that, you know, when people do graduate, if they do go to university or get a degree level apprenticeship, that they can stay in the area that they're from. So we're building all these things out. And I think that's the best way, really, that we can better connect with the electorate. And you're seeing that in, I'd say, mayoral areas more than the other areas outside them.
Wow. Thank you so much for that answer and for all of your answers and your time today, Steve. This series continues to be an absolute privilege to do, and really fantastic to have your time today and hear your views and your reflections on your time as mayor and where the whole model seems to be going next. So thank you so much.
Thanks,
And
Sam.
thanks everyone for joining us, and to everyone who'll be tuning in later on. The series continues, and watch this space for our next update about who we'll be talking to next. I believe it's Ben Houchen, who will be our first Conservative mayor in the series, and we'll be talking to him in September. So do sign up for that one, and we'll continue the conversation there. But until then, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again, Steve, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.